The lake was calm that morning, the sun glinting softly across the glassy surface as mist rose like smoke off the water. And I remember thinking how rare it was to find peace like this in the world until HOA Karen came storming down the gravel path, high heels clacking on the dirt like war drums, holding a clipboard in one hand and a phone in the other, already barking demands before she was even through the gate that read, "Private property, no trespassing," but that never stopped her before, because Karen wasn't just any HOA president, she was the self-declared Palmony, queen of the lakeside neighborhood, the self-important ruler of regulation and fines, and today, she had decided my wife, who had come to our cabin for a weekend of quiet reflection, was an unauthorized guest on what Karen claimed was community land, despite the ironclad deed we'd owned for a decade, recorded with the county, surveyed down to the inch, but that meant nothing to Karen, not when her need for control overpowered all facts and logic. So she walked right up to the porch where my wife sat reading a book and sipping her morning tea and demanded she vacate the premises, calling her a squatter and insisting the HOA rules didn't allow for long-term visitors, which was laughable because it wasn't a visitor situation. It was her land, her home, her name on the paperwork right beside mine. And if Karen had bothered to look up from her fantasy of authority, she might have realized she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. But of course, she didn't, because she was too busy dialing 911, loudly proclaiming that a trespasser refused to leave and the backup was needed immediately, and within minutes, flashing lights appeared at the end of the lane, 3 county cruisers and 2 officers on foot walking up to our gate, while Karen smiled like a cat that had already swallowed the canary, thinking she was about to witness my wife being arrested, removed in handcuffs from the home she owned, humiliated in front of the neighborhood, because that's what Karen did. She didn't solve problems. She created them and lived off the chaos. But what she didn't know, what not a single person on that road suspected, was that my wife was not just a homeowner or a quiet woman with a gentle smile. She was the director of state police operations, one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the state, responsible for COMRE, overseeing investigations, field response coordination, and even officer training standards. And as the sheriff's deputies stepped forward with confusion in their eyes, and Karen shoved a stack of bogus HOA paperwork in their hands, my wife stood calmly, opened her phone, and made one call, not yelling, not threatening, just quietly stating a situation report and dispatching a code phrase that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement chain of command. And just like that, within 15 minutes, 2 black SUVs.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
15 minutes. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows rolled up, unmarked but unmistakable to anyone in the know, and the officers who'd once been preparing to escort my wife off the property suddenly snapped to attention, saluting as the regional task commander stepped out and addressed her as "Ma'am," while Karen's face began to melt with disbelief, asking what was happening, what jurisdiction this was, and why no one was arresting the trespasser. But the shift had already occurred the moment she made that call. This had become a state matter, not a neighborhood complaint, and the task force leader began asking Karen some very serious questions, including whether she had a legal warrant, whether she had title authority over this land, and whether she was aware that filing false police reports is a criminal offense, to which Karen stammered, trying to blame confusing boundaries and shared community water rights. But she didn't know that just the day before, my wife had already ordered a fresh aerial survey of the lakefront drones, satellite tapari, overlays, GIs mapped in high resolution, and the report proved without a doubt the cabin, the dock, the surrounding woods, and even the gravel access road were 100% owned by US. Not the HOA, not the community, and certainly not Karen. And when the task force presented this in front of everyone on body cams, in front of 2 HOA board members who'd come to watch the drama, it wasn't my wife who was in trouble, it was Karen. Because not only had she trespassed onto private land, Not only had she violated harassment and privacy statutes, but she had weaponized law enforcement for personal gain. And that kind of abuse doesn't get swept under the rug anymore. Not when the person you're targeting runs the very system you tried to use against her. And as citations were written up and a legal notice was handed to Karen right there on the lawn, the crowd that had gathered, neighbors peeking from porches, a few holding coffee mugs and watching like it was a movie, began murmuring, no longer in support of Karen, but in growing unease at what this meant for them. Because if she could be wrong about something this big, what else had she overstepped on? What else had she lied about? And when one of the officers stepped aside to talk to my wife privately and said, "Mom, I think this goes deeper," she simply nodded and replied, "It does initiate phase 2, and that's when I knew Karen had crossed into territory she'd never walk back from, because my wife wasn't just going to let this slide. She was going to tear down everything Karen had built on BR. Lies and fake authority, not through shouting or fighting, but with law, with truth, and with power no HOA bully could ever dream of controlling. And as Karen stomped away from the cabin, red-faced and muttering threats, flanked by officers writing her up for trespass and obstruction, I took my wife's hand, smiled, and said, "Ready to clean house?" To which she smiled back and said, "Let's take out the trash." The moment Karen stomped away from our cabin porch after getting cited for trespassing by officers who had arrived expecting to remove my wife, I knew it was far from over. Because people like her don't just give up. They regroup, they escalate, and they plot revenge behind closed HOA meetings and fake committee memos. And sure enough, within 24 hours, she filed 3 new complaints against us. One with the county tax office, one with the fire marshal, and another with the local zoning board. All of them baseless but designed to slow us down, to drown us in paperwork and force us into court. But what Karen didn't understand, what she refused to even imagine, was that my wife didn't just have the legal upper hand. She had the institutional upper hand, the kind that comes from sitting at tables with state senators and overseeing law enforcement budgets across multiple jurisdictions. And while Karen was busy trying to weaponize local law.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
And while Karen was busy trying to weaponize local authority, we were quietly preparing an investigative file thicker than a phone book, because once you cross the line from nuisance to threat, the gloves come off. And my wife began documenting everything. Timestamps, recordings, statements from other harassed neighbors who had long been too scared to speak up, but now found courage knowing the state was watching. And what started as a petty lakefront complaint quickly unraveled into something much, much bigger. As we dug into the HOA's financials, we discovered over $70,000 in landscape. Fees paid to a company that didn't exist. Invoices signed only by Karen and funneled through an account in her cousin's name. And suddenly this wasn't just about harassment. It was about embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of position. And as we compiled our evidence, we made sure not to act too soon, because Karen needed to feel safe, needed to think she'd gotten away with everything, and over the next few days, she did what Karen always does, doubled down. Hosted an emergency HOA meeting where she tried to push through a rule banning all short-term guests, a nice personally approved by the HOA President, which was clearly targeted at us, but also affected Detras. Dozens of other property owners, most of whom had vacation rentals or family members visiting during the summer, and that move alone turned half the board against her, but she couldn't see it, blinded by her own ego, walking into every room like she owned the world. And so when one of the board members leaked the meeting minutes to us complete, with voice memos of Karen gloating about how she handled the trespasser by calling in her cops, we handed it straight to the Internal Affairs Division that had already opened a case file with my wife's oversight. And now real investigators were involved. People who didn't care about Karen's pearl necklaces or sun hats or fake smile at the country club. They cared about statutes, money trails, and the misuse of public mana. Resources? And while Karen hosted luncheons and spread lies about us to anyone who'd listen, the state was quietly building a case so bulletproof Even her expensive lawyer cousin wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. And I remember one particular morning when the fog was low over the lake, the kind that makes everything quiet and still, and my wife sat with a steaming mug of coffee reviewing her tablet, flipping through security camera stills showing Karen standing on our porch holding a clipboard like she was an authority figure, and she said to me without looking up, she has no idea who she just declared war on. And she was right. Because Karen wasn't just poking a bear, she was playing with high voltage, and as the investigation deepened, it turned out this wasn't her first time bending rules. There had been past complaints from other neighborhoods she'd previously managed, and in one shocking twist, we uncovered an old civil suit where she tried to claim eminent domain over a retired veteran's lakeside dock and lost badly in court, yet somehow still ended up president of another HOA a year later. And this time she thought she'd found an easy target, just a quiet wife at a cabin, no visible defense, just solitude and a lakeside view, but she'd built her little fantasy world on a powder keg, and it was about to blow. And it all came to a head 2 weeks after the incident, when Karen, unable to stand that the sheriff's department hadn't followed up with an arrest, decided to go bigger. She marched into the county commissioner's office and filed a formal complaint against my wife, listing threats of intimidation, abuse of badge, and disruption of HOA protocol, and she didn't know that the commissioner was already in direct contact with my wife due to monthly state briefings, so when he received the complaint, he didn't just laugh, he forwarded it to the state legal board along with a personal note that read, "This woman may need psychological evaluation," and that was the last straw for the governor's office, which had already been briefed on the growing corruption investigation and greenlit a full audit of the HOA's books, legal compliance, and board operations, and the team assigned wasn't some sleepy civil office. It was the State Bureau of Regulatory Enforcement, a group known for shutting down illegal corporations, crooked municipal boards, and yes, abusive HOA operations. And when they arrived, it wasn't with clipboards. It was with badges, warrants, and a mandate to freeze assets and detain records. And while Karen was hosting a weekend barbecue by the clubhouse, full of fake laughs and sangria, a black van rolled up with enforcement officials and handed her a formal notice of investigation, to which she screamed in protest, tried to say it was a witch hunt, but the officers weren't interested in drama, just compliance. And by the end of that day, they had boxed up 2 years of financial documents, pulled digital records from HOA servers, and froze the account used for Karen's landscaping contracts. And when the local news picked up the story, state launches probe into HOA fraud following Lake Cabin, dispute Karen's name and photo, were all over the headlines, not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale, and suddenly all the neighbors who used to bow to her started posting no HOA harassment signs in their yards, and the whispers turned into roars, and now everyone wanted to know how far this power went, what else had been forged, stolen, or abused under Karen's rule. And as for my wife, she didn't gloat, didn't even celebrate. She simply kept working, attending briefings, guiding the investigation with clean professionalism, never letting it get personal. But I could tell from her eyes that she hadn't forgotten that day on the porch when Karen tried to use police as a weapon, and I knew when the time came, justice wouldn't just be served, it would be etched in stone. And that chapter closed with one final scene. Karen, now stripped of her HOA title, standing behind a podium outside a courthouse, sunglasses hiding puffy eyes, trying to defend her actions to a swarm of reporters, but behind her, the state's attorney was already filing charges, and my wife, watching from our cabin deck with binoculars, took a sip of her tea and softly said, "She's not done paying yet," and I knew she meant it. It didn't take long after the audit for things to truly unravel, because when the state gets involved, especially with someone like my wife overseeing the details, there are no warning shots, just consequences, fast and surgical. And by the time the HOA board received their cease and desist letter from the Bureau of Regulatory Enforcement, half of them were already looking for lawyers. Because Karen's reign hadn't just been about power, it had been about fear, coercion, and quiet threats that were now fully documented and backed by statements from over 14 different residents who'd remained compar. Silent for years, intimidated by Karen's tactics and lies, but with my wife working the investigation from within the state police and the governor's office quietly watching the case, those walls of silence began to crumble fast. And what poured out wasn't just misconduct, it was pure rot. Emails where Karen falsified.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
It was pure rot. Emails where Karen falsified votes, text messages to board members instructing them how to block motions that didn't favor her personal friends, and even video surveillance from the clubhouse showing her forging signatures during AT closed session meeting, where she passed a rule allowing the HOA to fine homeowners without prior notice, and as the news coverage intensified, every HOA across the states began looking inward, worried they'd be next, while Karen's little empire of rules, threats, and staged HOA emergencies collapsed beneath her heels, and at the center of it all, my wife remained composed, firm, and dangerously effective, coordinating with state auditors and legal officials, while remaining hands-off enough not to show conflict of interest, because that's how good she was, clean, thorough, and 10 steps ahead. And it all came to a boiling point the day the state issued a motion to dissolve the HOA altogether, based on financial fraud, civil rights violations, and community abuse. And as Karen received the final letter delivered by a trooper she used to bully at town meetings, she burst into our cabin property again, screaming at the gate, demanding answers, ranting about revenge and backroom deals, until my wife calmly stepped outside, not in uniform, not with a badge, just as a woman who had watched this person try to rip away her dignity weeks ago, simply said, "You tried to use the law as a weapon, and now it's holding the mirror up," before walking away and leaving Karen sobbing in the gravel, powerless for the first time in her life, and within days, the now defunct HOA's camper. Assets were frozen, their bank accounts seized, and all remaining fines they had tried to place on homeowners were legally nullified by court order, which we helped deliver door to door to our neighbors who finally breathed relief after years of unjustified pressure. And it was then, after the courthouse hearing where Karen was publicly censured and barred from participating in any residential governance ever again, that the story could have ended, but it didn't, because as one chapter closed, another opened when residents, now grateful for what my wife had done, banded together and petitioned the county to form a voluntary civic committee led not by power-hungry tyrants, but by fair-minded neighbors who believed in community rather than control. And though my wife declined to serve on it herself, she recommended a young woman who had been harassed by Karen for building a wheelchair ramp for her father, someone who now stood tall and proud, elected chair of the new civic council, with her first act being the public removal of every HOA Keep Out sign still hanging across the lakeside fences, and when the last one came down, the neighborhood cheered, and even the sheriff showed up to say a few words, praising the strength of citizens who stood up to power gone rogue, and my wife, ever modest, simply smiled and said, "I just stood where I was already standing. They came to me, but I knew better. I knew this wasn't just a Khan reaction. This was justice authored by someone who knew exactly how to turn abuse of power into an opportunity for truth." And the final act came a week later, when Karen's personal lake access lot, the one she used to walk through every day with a clipboard and fake authority, was quietly purchased at auction by a private buyer. And who was that buyer? You guessed it, me. Through a shell trust, just like she never saw coming. And when we fenced off that path and built a quiet stone patio where her private dock used to sit, it was more than just poetic. It was permanent. And as we installed a new sign that read, "Private family land, no trespassing, state protected," I watched my wife smile for the first time in weeks, knowing that not only had she stood her ground, she had dismantled something corrupt and built something better in its place. And as we sat by the fire pit on our land, now finally and fully ours with no HOA to threaten it ever again, she leaned over and whispered, Next time someone tells me I don't belong somewhere, I'll just show them my badge and my boots. And I laughed because I knew there wouldn't be a next time. Not after what Karen tried and failed to do. Not with the entire Pammer. Neighborhood watching. Not with the law finally on the side of the people it was meant to protect.